Hi, sorry about that, guys. Yes, so my name is Andrea Gauthier. I'm a 1T2 grad. And my PhD research investigates how we can leverage game design to enhance learning, particularly in the area of molecular biology. And several of my past UnCon talks have centered around that. Today I'm asking a little bit of a different question. What role does culture play in game-based learning itself? And I can tell you straight away that I don't actually know the answer to this, and it's all conjecture at this point. But I came across this kind of interesting finding in my research that I thought might be interesting to discuss. Because when we design interactive learning tools for a very multicultural society like Canada, maybe it's not very fair that we assume that everyone's homogenous in our population and that they might take different views into an application. But first, let's cover the basis of what the actual research involved. The challenge that we're trying to communicate here is that, or that we're trying to tackle, is that undergrad students don't really understand the complexity of molecular dynamics. And this is difficult for them because we know as illustrators that all molecules move very randomly, but that's not how it's necessarily depicted. And it's difficult for them to grasp because we envision cells as being these highly efficient little machines. And then we think about randomness or chance as a very inefficient mechanism. Like, think of gambling. That's not a very efficient way to make money. So these are two concepts that clash, and so students naturally revert to the thinking that molecules do in some way move directly or have sensory mechanisms to guide them in the cell. Now, the literature suggests that a great way to help students overcome these misconceptions is by having them confront their expectations through productively negative experiences. And in a nutshell, all this means is allow people to make mistakes and fail and hopefully learn from their experiences. And if you think about it, this type of conceptual change strategy is great for interactive media and games, which is what we tried to do in our game Maul Worlds. So take this level, for example. The player has to open that ligand-gated membrane channel to get to the through the channel to the checkpoint on the other side of the membrane. And under their misconception of directed molecular motion, they release only one ligand, expecting it to bind directly to the channel. They fail in that it moves off randomly, and they learn very quickly that by increasing the concentration of ligands and the temperature, there's a greater chance of a binding event occurring and being successful in the game. So the levels get more and more complicated or complex, you might say, as they go on. And the player is expected to balance these different factors of concentration, temperature, and crowding to increase the rates of interactions or decrease, depending on the scenario. And this is all in the context of curriculum-aligned content, like vesicle formation that you see here. And the player is expected to click on molecules in the environment and explore and discover that oh, okay, I have to make a vesicle in order to get past the membrane to the checkpoint. So you can use it as like a little transporter. And it goes on in a similar way. So to determine if game design in and of itself actually added anything to the learning process, we also created this interactive control app called Maul Sandbox. And it allows students to explore all the same cellular processes in much like the same manner. You can increase the temperature, concentration, crowding. But in a way, it facilitates more of an experimental learning experience because you can easily reset the app and systematically adjust all these different factors. So here's the same vesicle formation level, but instead of the player exploring the world with a character and discovering that that's what they had to do, form vesicle formation, they're just given a bit of text at the very top of the screen that says, facilitate vesicle formation and docking. So while it is less exploratory, you could summarize it as being more experimental and systematic. So we did a study spanning the length of a semester to gauge how students' misconceptions might change throughout the course of a molecular biology class. So we gave students a misconceptions test at the beginning of the semester, and those who completed it were invited to participate in a randomized control trial where they played either Maul Worlds or Maul Sandbox, the game and the control, for 20 to 45 minutes. They could stop voluntarily when they wanted to after that. And then everybody, including the group who didn't have any intervention, completed a post-test. So did Maul Worlds and Maul Sandbox facilitate conceptual change? So we developed an analysis that looked at a few different factors, so stimulus group being the primary factor of interest here, but also gender and whether or not English was their native language. The only reason that we included English as a native language as a variable was in case maybe overall non-native English speakers performed a bit more poorly on the test because of language barriers. Or also, you might be less engaged or motivated to use a tool if it's not in the language in which you're most comfortable. For example, I speak French, but I'd be much less motivated to use a tool in French than a tool in English. The other possible confounders that we included in the model were students' engagement in their biology course, their academic achievement, and their gaming habits, which may either influence the learning process and also their engagement in the apps. So the results were that course engagement, academic achievement, and gaming habits had no bearing on conceptual change outcomes. So regardless of about how good of a student they were, they all performed similarly. Also, males and females performed similarly, as well as those who were native English speakers and those who were not native English speakers. Luckily, stimulus group was a significant factor, and this is expected. And if it wasn't a significant factor, that means the apps didn't work at all. So that was good. But we also found an unexpected interaction effect between the stimulus group and native English speaking. So essentially what this means is that native and non-native English speakers, even though overall they performed exactly the same, they performed differently depending on which stimulus they were exposed to, which I'll show you a bit in a second. So this graph looks at all participants. It's a bit blown out. The y-axis measures misconceptions, so lower scores are actually better in this scenario, and it goes from pre-test to post-test. So we can see here that the baseline group, which is the gray line, they didn't get any interventions, kind of had a steady 5.5 misconceptions over the course of the semester, no change. The game group improved significantly more than the baseline group, and the change in itself was significant. And the control group also improved to a nearly significant. It was like 0.001 off of being significant. So anyways, it was a trending result, but in terms of how different the control and game group were, they improved almost identically. So both of the tools were very efficient, essentially. However, we did see that interaction effect between native English-speaking and stimulus group. So if we break that result down further, we can see that in the native English speakers on the left-hand side, those who were exposed to the game performed significantly better than baseline, but not if they were given the control group or the control application. On the other hand, we see complete opposite trend in non-native English speakers who performed extremely well with the control app, but no change from baseline in terms of statistical significance with the game. So that was interesting, and their feedback about how much they enjoyed the game also reflected this. So for example, if we look at the native English speakers, those who were exposed to the control group found the app much more abstract, that The challenges were much too difficult. They enjoyed it much less than people who got the game. If we look at the control group by itself, so just the blue lines, the native English speakers also had those kind of poor, they didn't like the app in comparison to these guys who really liked the app. So those kind of supported the trends in misconception loss, so the actual learning outcomes. And the thing is that I don't think that this can be explained down to language, because the apps use the exact same language. And if people had difficulty with interacting with written text, the effect should be the same between the two tools. And that's not what we see. So this got me thinking about whether there might be some cultural differences at play. And there was really no way of determining that based on the data that I had at the time. Native English speakers is a pretty generic variable and could include French Canadians or international students from anywhere in the globe, or even Canadians, but who had non-English speaking parents. So it was pretty ambiguous at this point. So I wanted to find out more about that. I sent out a follow-up survey to everyone who participated. And it was a pretty low response rate, only about 30% of participants responded, so I couldn't do very much in-depth analysis. But I did get a better sense about who our participants were. So we asked them about what cultural group they self-identify with. And the questionnaire was clear that I wasn't interested in ethnicity, but culturally, who do you feel, what cultural group might you feel more connected with? And we can see that a fairly even distribution do self-identify as North American, though a larger proportion of native English speakers who are blue versus non-native English speakers. And then the majority, so 52% of non-native English speakers self-identify as being either Middle Eastern, Western Central Asian, East or Southeast Asian, but also quite a large proportion of native English speakers as well. Furthermore, we asked them about their primary caregiver and what culture they associate with. And as you can see, the native English speakers are pretty evenly spread out across cultural groups. Now, these cultural groups are bundled up. They were very spread out and had more options, but for concision, I just collapsed them together. And again, the majority, 75%, belong to the two groups that we discussed before. So my question was, how might the culture in which we are raised affect how we learn and potentially how we perceive and benefit from interactive media? So this is Hofstede's model of cultural dimensions, which was one of the first to quantify this. And before going any further, I do want to emphasize that this is a very drastic oversimplification of culture, and this doesn't account for the fact that many people belong to many different cultures and bring in aspects from all over the world. But it does facilitate a kind of a simple discussion, which is beneficial for a very short presentation like this. So to get into how these different factors might affect learning, we have a power distance index. So cultures that rank high on this scale might be more accepting of power inequalities in a society, and they respect authority figures more. And this could affect student-teacher relationships and how you communicate knowledge from the top down. We have individualistic cultures, which prioritize personal needs and goals over the needs and goals of the group, which is more collectivist. And this could translate into preferences for group or collaborative work, teamwork, versus individual work. And conceivably, this could extend to games being single-player or multiplayer preferences. We have the masculinity-femininity scale, and I don't like the terminology of this at all. It's very gender normative, but it was the 80s, so but it essentially equates to how goal-driven and assertive, masculine, of course, a society is versus being more nurturing and cooperative. So perhaps this could translate to competitive versus cooperative styles of gameplay. We have uncertainty avoidance. So this is intolerance of different or new ideas or beliefs, which you could think about the acceptance of new technologies in a classroom. Long-term oriented cultures are very serious about education, about being prepared for the future, and are very pragmatic about learning and gaining new knowledge. So this perhaps these individuals might see the fun and more playful aspects of a game as interfering with the learning process that is kind of superfluous and not needed. And finally, we have indulgence versus restraint. Indulgent cultures feel free to seek gratification related to fun, whereas cultures toward the restraint end of the scale observe more social norms and tend to be more work-oriented. So conceivably, and these are just all my own conjectures as how this might relate to a gaming experience, perhaps individuals who fall more on the restraint end of the scale have more social stigmas around video games and gaming habits, which might influence how they are, how likely they are to engage in games for learning activities around their peers. So, while video games are a very popular form of entertainment around the world, these cultural dimensions and potentially even the social stigmas around video gaming in different areas might prevent games from being effective learning tools if the correct contextual framing is not made. So all that is to say that there's really not any literature that's supporting any of this, and this is just one study that I found an interesting finding and subject to replication. But I think it's something that we should consider when designing for a multicultural society like Canada, because we don't want only 50% of our target audience to benefit. So the next steps in this is that Jody and I are working with Sun Reap, who's our undergraduate research opportunity student, and he's going to be doing a survey with UTM students to investigate these relationships a bit further. And maybe that's something we can discuss next year. Thanks.